If they want to blow it up, let them. Why should we care? This is Grindavik, a small town in Iceland. I'm looking at it on Google Maps, and I don't see any volcanoes anywhere near it. Nowhere. And yet, right here inside the town, this thing suddenly shows up. That's the kind of thing only a volcano can do. But there isn't one here. At first, cracks started appearing. They patched them up like ordinary damage until one worker simply vanished in 1 second. After that, it was obvious. The problem wasn't on the surface. Something was happening under the town. And the strangest part, you can't even point to the source on a map. This didn't start near Grindavik, it started inside it. The first eruption happened in March 2021. Then more followed, building up until the point of no return, December 18th, 2023. On November 10th, a huge sinkhole opened up right in the middle of Grindavik. The eastern side was hit the hardest, and from that moment on, life there was never the same. The houses are still standing, sort of, but they're no longer houses in the usual sense. The ground is sunk, the buildings have tilted, and the walls are cracking. A month before the fourth eruption in November 2023, authorities evacuated about 4,000 Grindavik residents. People were sometimes allowed to return briefly to check on their homes, grab a few belongings, and see what was still intact. On December 18th, the eruption began just 1.8 miles from the town. The lava flowed in the other direction, and Grindavik was spared that time. By December 22nd, some residents were allowed to return home, and the next day everyone was, though only a few dozen people actually chose to go back. At that point, it still felt like life might return to normal, that the eruptions would end and everyone would simply come home again. But on January 14th, 2024, another eruption hit. It lasted about 2 days, and this time it was far closer and far more brutal. A fissure opened less than 328 feet from town. Lava broke through the protective barriers and destroyed 3 homes. People were rushed out again. And that's when it became clear this wasn't a one-off anymore. It was becoming the new normal. During that eruption, the only place in Grindavik that didn't move an inch was the harbor. And in the middle of all that, another story unfolded. A very sad one. Shortly before the January eruption, a man went missing. It's believed he fell into a fissure that opened because of earthquakes and volcanic activity and was killed. He was a 50-year-old Ludvig Peterson. He'd been working at the site, filling in cracks that were appearing right under his feet. On January 10th, he disappeared, and search efforts began immediately. They had to be called off once rockfalls started, and it became clear the area was simply too dangerous to operate in. Essentially, he died on the job. An investigation's now underway because the working conditions were, to put it mildly, unsafe. The family's demanding an attempt to recover his remains, but the authorities keep giving the same answer. Going down there's too dangerous for the living. What exactly happened is still only partly clear. It seems the 2 men were working together. One of them stepped away for just a minute, and when he came back, the other was gone. His tools were later found wedged in a crack. From this image, you can get a rough idea of what the crevice looks like, the one the poor man fell into. The crack's believed to be more than 98 feet deep. The opening is narrow, but it widens further down. The drop to the water is about 65 feet, and the water continues another 42 to 46 feet below that. Search teams managed to descend only about that far. An excavator worked for a long time trying to widen the passage to give rescuers access. It worked almost non-stop, but apparently there was no success. With all that happening, you can't help but wonder, how are people actually warned about the danger? Once evacuation begins, they trigger the emergency sirens and push out SMS alerts. Fast, direct, no extra words. At the same time, the authorities issue official notices. They state it plainly, walking out of the city on foot is strongly discouraged. Cracks and sinkholes can open up at any moment, and falling into one can be fatal. So it's basically, what you do next is up to you, at your own risk. So the people of Grindavik were officially allowed to return home for good after the string of eruptions. Officially being the key word, because only about 100 people actually made it back into town. And that's out of nearly 4,000. Even so, the local police chief, Ulfur Ludvigsson, advised everyone not to stay overnight. You can, sure, but only if you really, really want to. Some homes are so badly damaged that even grabbing personal belongings was difficult. People went inside with safety harnesses clipped to a lifeline. The ground is split with cracks and the infrastructure's in ruins. Hundreds of earthquakes have twisted buildings out of shape and torn roads apart. It's hard to stay indifferent when you see it with your own eyes. Deep fissures cut through the smooth asphalt in parking lots. Houses with cracked concrete walls stand behind rows of orange flags and metal barriers. On an empty playground, the swings sway softly in the wind. The lava flow seems to have cooled, cold to the touch like stone, but gray smoke still rises from it into the air. The ground is still holding on to its heat. The water pipes and power lines are damaged. There's no heating, and the homes are bitterly cold. And in some areas of Grindavik and around the town, lava simply buried roads and houses, leaving behind jagged rocks that smoldered for months. In short, even though people were allowed to return, no one yet understood that the chain of tragedies wasn't over, and that what came next could be even worse. Magma continued to build up beneath the area, and the official danger level for Grindavik remained extremely high. Before long, it became clear that the city's future was in doubt, so much so that the government had to draft a special law allowing residents to sell their homes to a state-owned company, just so people could leave town and start a new life somewhere else. And when another eruption on February 8, 2024 caused serious damage, including to the hot water pipeline at the Svartsengi power plant, everything fell into place. Life here would never go back to quiet and normal. After that, the eruptions came one after another, long, powerful bursts, with lava creeping closer and closer each time. By the end of 2024, aerial photos made one thing clear: the lava field had almost completely encircled Grindavik. Back in 2023, when the volcanic activity pushed right up to Grindavik, engineers were confronted with a nearly impossible problem. How do you even stop molten rock at around 2200 degrees Fahrenheit? That's how one of the most intense engineering standoffs with nature in recent years began. The barriers you're seeing aren't just walls, they were built racing against time, in winter. And in the end, a ring of 88 million cubic feet of earth, about 8.4 miles long, encircled the town. Walking the full length is like crossing 135 football fields back to back. When the first lava flows cut off roads and started creeping toward the town, the barriers actually worked. Most of the molten mass was diverted away from homes and critical infrastructure, including the Svartsengi power plant, which supplies electricity and hot water to almost the entire region. But that wasn't the end of it. If you want vehicles to drive on lava, you first have to cool it with water, then grate it, reinforce it, and test whether it can actually hold weight. In total, engineers built 23 miles of new roads, and 5.5 miles of them run directly over fresh lava fields. This map shows where the barriers were built, how many there are, and just how massive their total length is. And the engineers didn't stop there. They made a move Iceland hadn't attempted since 1973. Powerful pumps drew seawater and sprayed it straight onto the moving lava. The water hardened the surface into a solid crust, making it possible to slow the flow or steer it away. It had only been done once before, during the famous eruption on Himeai in the Vestmannaeyjar archipelago. But when there's no other option, desperation quickly turns into engineering solutions. For Grindavik and Svartsengi, authorities purchased lava cooling equipment worth nearly $500 million Icelandic kronas. The problem was that the machinery didn't arrive right away, and there was no time to spare. So they started with the simplest thing they had at their disposal: cooling the lava using standard fire trucks. The main problem is that this volcano is completely unpredictable. At any moment, a crack can open up on an ordinary street literally right under your feet, and lava can start pouring out. And that's not a metaphor. The risk of new fissures appearing with no warning is still very high. Seriously, I'm not even exaggerating right now. A new eruption can start at any time and in any spot near the volcano, including places where people are standing right now. It's the kind of situation where you're just walking down the street or crossing the road and then your luck runs out. The ground splits open and lava comes out. The odds aren't huge, sure, but in Iceland, this isn't science fiction, it's a real threat people live with. To be specific, the volcano responsible for all this is Saknakagígar. Let's avoid the confusion. It's not Fagradalsfjall, the volcano that erupted so spectacularly in 2021 and 2022. Saknakagígar doesn't even look like a textbook volcano. It isn't a tall mountain with a single crater like we're used to. Instead, it's a chain of craters lined up in a row. Basically, it's a fissure volcano. Lava doesn't come out at one point, it breaks through long cracks in the ground. And those cracks can form almost anywhere whenever magma builds up beneath the surface. That's exactly why it's so dangerous. The Reykjanes Peninsula is Iceland's most active volcanic region, and one of the most active anywhere on Earth. It sits right on the mid-Atlantic ridge where the North American and Eurasian plates slowly pull apart. They're drifting apart all the time. That constant movement causes earthquakes, fissures, and eruptions, and since 2018, all of it's become noticeably more intense. Locals say they never imagined something like this could actually happen. Like, sure, maybe over 1 million years, but not within their own lifetime. Others remember being taught since childhood that Reykjanes would crack someday. It's just that no one really believed they'd live to see it. And for the terrain itself, it all makes perfect sense. Eruptions come in cycles. You get active periods lasting about 200 to 350 years, followed by long, quiet stretches of 700 to 1200 years. The last active phase ran from the 10th to the 13th century, and it looks like the next one may be starting now. It's freaking lava. It doesn't owe anyone anything. A crater wall can collapse, something can rupture somewhere, and molten rock will instantly find a new outlet instead of sticking to the old channel. In Iceland, there's another complication. Eruptions there often don't come from a single point, but from long fractures. Cracks can open at different spots along the same line, and then the flow heads off in a completely unexpected direction. Of course, scientists aren't just guessing. They build models and factor in the terrain, old fissures, current activity, basically a whole bunch of variables. They've done that kind of modeling for the Reykjanes Peninsula too, but it's more like a probability map where lava is most likely to break out, where it has the easiest route and which areas are at risk. As for what actually happens on the ground, it could still play out in all sorts of ways. But why do the warnings come after the fact, when the lava's already moving? An early warning system tracks a whole bunch of signals at once. Earthquakes, how often they happen and how strong they are, steam venting from the ground, new hotspots, slight ground uplift, small shifts in heat flow. All of that's monitored continuously. The real problem is different. Those warning signs can drag on for weeks, months, even years, and still never end in an eruption, or they can suddenly fade away. A classic example is Italy's Phlegraean Field caldera, which has been sending worrying signals for over 6 decades. If people were evacuated every time the ground started acting weird, living there would be impossible. Evacuations would never stop, and most of the time there wouldn't even be a real reason. Okay, but if it's a dangerous area, why not evacuate in advance? Because it's considered dangerous by default. Evacuating just in case would basically mean never living there at all. During Iceland's most recent eruption in 2025, some people simply refused to leave. Evacuation orders were issued and repeated, but a few stayed anyway, fully aware of the high risks. It wasn't just stubbornness. For many, Grindavik is home. Their job, their business, their neighbors, their whole life in one place. In other words, it's not so easy to drop everything and go. Even after evacuations, people say openly that they want to return, keep the community together, and somehow hold on to the infrastructure. And there's one more thing. As we've said, volcanoes can surge with activity and then fall silent for long stretches, sometimes for hundreds of years. People know that, so they hang on to hope. Maybe this time they'll get lucky. But there's one more really important detail. Icelanders are used to volcanoes. They're literally everywhere. So for locals, it's not the end of the world or a constant state of panic. The country's infrastructure was built from the start with the geology in mind. Eruptions are something they're prepared for, and that level of readiness is among the best in the world. Volcanic activity has long been a part of everyday life here, with all its pros and cons. That includes geothermal energy, which half the country relies on, and usually eruptions don't hit the entire island. They affect specific local areas near the source. People just keep living their lives around it. Icelanders have been through this before. Volcanoes are part of their landscape and their history, not some abstract threat. That's why their attitude toward risk is so much calmer than that of tourists or people watching from the outside. But then I thought, how do you even plan an evacuation of a city when you don't know which side the lava will come from or where it's going to flow? I looked it up and found the city's evacuation plan. It's really small, and honestly, people don't have many options. There are only 3 roads out of town, north, west, and east, because the sea's to the south. Evacuation is always done by car, of course. Nobody's running on foot. It would be far too slow and ineffective. The whole process is supported by the authorities, emergency services, and police who can point people in the right direction, and there are regular broadcast updates about which routes to take. No one's left to fend for themselves. People end up traveling across the country, wherever they can manage to go. Of course, they're all exhausted from the constant stress and uncertainty, not knowing whether they'll be able to return home at all and whether it would even be safe. The real issue is that people were ripped away from the life they had. They can't get back into their homes. Many no longer have jobs because their work depended on the city, while their expenses keep climbing. For a lot of families, it's been a major financial blow. The houses are destroyed, but the mortgage is still there. The volcano isn't going to pay it off for you, only. On top of that, they have to cover rent for temporary housing unless they're lucky enough to stay with relatives for free. Since November, the state has been providing short-term financial assistance, and the government has bought out more than 200 homes for resettlement, but money doesn't solve everything. People are still grieving the loss of their homes and watching their community fall apart before their eyes. Some of the nearly 4,000 residents and a few businesses have returned to Grindavik, but the majority relocated elsewhere in the country once the government started buying out buildings that were declared unsafe to live in. By September 2024, the state real estate company had purchased almost 900 of the town's 1,200 buildings. The organization was created on February 27th after a series of evacuations once it became clear the situation wasn't going to resolve quickly. Residents were asked to submit buyout applications by the end of the year, and at the same time, officials began discussing whether that deadline should be extended. Not everyone was happy. People were outraged by the requirement to completely empty their apartments before handing them over. Storing belongings and hauling away trash turned into real problems. Still, it was hardly surprising. Buying out an entire town, something no one has done before. Company representatives later said the workload at first was overwhelming and there were far too many applications. But over time, the process was brought under control and overall it worked. Residents were also given the option to buy their homes back in the future. There are no other plans. The properties are expected to be sold back the same way for 95% of the fire insurance value listed in the policy. As for the town, it's basically frozen in time for now. Reconstruction keeps being postponed again and again because of the risk of new eruptions. Recent eruptions have also looked worse than the earlier ones, more dangerous and more intense. During the latest eruption, Grindavik and the nearby Blue Lagoon were evacuated again. This is already the 11th eruption since 2021, when a new active phase began on the Reykjanes Peninsula southwest of Reykjavik. It started early in the morning. Around 6:30, an earthquake swarm began near the Sundaker crater, roughly the same area as before. Then at 9:45 local time, the eruption broke through the ground north of the protective barrier not far from town. An orange-red fissure spewing lava and smoke quickly stretched south. By 10 a.m., it had breached the defensive walls north of Grindavik, and sirens wailed across the town. By 12:30, the main crack had reached around 4,000 feet in length. At the same time, another fissure opened between the protective barriers and the town itself. Almost immediately, reports came in that a hot water pipeline in northern Grindavik had been damaged. That was a clear sign the fractures have reached inside the town limits. Iceland's head of civil protection also addressed those who chose to stay. He urged them to evacuate immediately, warning that this eruption could be far larger than the recent ones. The magma corridor is longer, it's built up a lot of magma, and the next developments could look very different from what people have seen so far. Another eruption followed soon after. The Reykjanes Peninsula had to be evacuated yet again, tourists and locals alike, marking the 12th eruption in the region since 2021. It started at around 4 a.m. after an intense seismic swarm. Magma forced its way up through the crust, ripping open a fissure near the Sundaker crater, and estimates put the crack at roughly 2,300 to 3,300 feet in length. Thick plumes of smoke shot upward, and footage once more reveals lava flows spreading across the ground. We're listing these almost like it's routine, but this is literally hell. 12 eruptions in 5 years. Nothing there ever calms down. Lava keeps returning, with only brief pauses of a few months. There's hardly any space left for a stable, ordinary life. The problem isn't going away. It'll keep reminding people of itself for a long time. Fissure eruptions can last for centuries. We don't know how long this will take, maybe a couple of years, maybe longer. And there's a very real scenario where lava could eventually swallow the town. Icelandic geophysicists say that openly. Even so, in October 2025, the authorities unveiled long-term development plans for Grindavik. North of town, they plan to build protective walls 6 to 10 feet high to shield it from future lava flows. They also presented an updated city plan ahead of a possible reopening. Some houses will be demolished, others rebuilt, and parts of town will be made livable again. Work at the harbor continues. Many employees just commute now from nearby towns where things feel safer. By the way, there's one more important detail. Locals have been sharply criticizing reports describing a ghost town buried under lava. The head of Grindavic's town council says those stories are deeply discouraging because they're not true, and because the town is already under enough strain. People are doing their best to live normally. Many still travel to Grindavík for work every single day. What's more, locals say this kind of coverage hurts not only them, but all of Iceland, especially tourism. The chair of Grindavík's executive council stressed that out of almost 1,200 homes, only about 80 are unfit to live in. That's roughly 7%. So the town isn't deserted. Residents and tourists are there every day, suggesting otherwise is highly irresponsible. At the same time, safety measures are being stepped up, cracks are being filled or fenced off, repaired areas are tested for stability, and warning signs are going up across town. Life goes on here. It's just that everyone is very anxious. But what if the volcano erupts again? On the Reykjanes Peninsula and in Grindavik, the authorities have installed a new evacuation siren system. It was introduced because volcanic activity is still ongoing and the weather keeps changing. The sirens are used in only one situation, when an eruption is considered imminent and people need to be moved out fast. You can't confuse the sound for anything else. Loud, continuous, leaving no room for doubt. It's a clear message. Evacuate immediately and follow civil protection instructions. You owe me a like. See you later.